The biblical text is a material artifact, a cultural production from a particular context. Context always matters. The world depicted in the Hebrew Bible is part of a larger, ancient Near Eastern world. The ancient Israelites we read about in the Bible share many aspects of culture, including language, worldviews, customs, and cultural norms, with the larger ancient world. In an effort to expose you to an element of shared cultures, this lecture is about covenants. Readers are introduced to the character Moses in the book of Exodus. We're all familiar with the story of Moses, his call, and his legendary role in the Exodus. Beginning in Exodus 3, we learn about the call of Moses. Moses encounters the divine in the form of a burning bush and is assigned to go to Pharaoh and bring the people out of Egypt. This appearance of God is called a theophany. Beginning in the 5th chapter, Pharaoh refuses to let the Israelites go, so God rains down judgment in the form of plagues. The people finally leave Egypt, miraculously cross the Red Sea, and find themselves tested in the wilderness. In the 19th chapter, we learn that the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai, where they set up camp. According to certain biblical writers, the Israelites will be in Sinai for a while, nearly a year. Upon their arrival, Moses makes the first of several trips up the mountain at Sinai. On one of those trips, Yahweh announces that he is about to make a covenant with the Israelites. They are to be God's special possession and a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And then, in Exodus 20, we find the giving of the 10 Commandments. Immediately after the appearance of Yahweh on the mountain, accompanied by all the manifestations of a theophany, thunder, lightning, fire, smoke, earthquake, trumpet blast, and cloud, God speaks to the Israelites, and we have the first set of remarks in the familiar text of the 10 Commandments. Most readers find the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, but the commandments are restated in Deuteronomy 5, verses 4 through 21. And the third version of the commandments is found in Exodus 34. The biblical writers actually refer to these commandments as the 10 words in Exodus 34:28, Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 10:4. The 10 Commandments' alternate designation, Decalogue, is taken from the Greek dekalogoi, meaning 10 sayings. There are 3 major covenants in the Hebrew Bible: the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and the Mosaic covenant or Sinai covenant. We will concentrate on the Mosaic or Sinai covenant in this lecture. In the Bible, the Hebrew word for covenant, berit, means something like contract, and it is used for various sorts of legal agreements, including marriage, slavery, solemn friendship, and especially a treaty. There are 2 widely attested types of treaty: the parity treaty, in which the 2 parties are presented equals, and the suzerainty treaty, in which one party, the suzerain, is superior to the other, the vassal, which is a medieval term. In the biblical world, Solomon, the king of Israel, and Hiram, the king of Tyre, cut a covenant in 1 Kings 5:12. The Hebrew there is Vayekratu barit, that is, they cut a covenant or made a treaty. This is an example of a parity treaty, similar to the one we find in 1 Kings 9:13, in which Hiram calls Solomon his brother. In parity treaties, the parties are equal. In suzerainty treaties, the parties are not equal. These are treaties between a superior and an inferior, like those between various kings of Assyria and Babylon and kings of Israel and Judah. Several metaphors are used to describe the relationship of vassal to suzerain, including master-servant and father-son. Consider Hosea 12:1, in which the smaller group, Ephraim, becomes a vassal to Assyria, and Ezekiel 17:13, in which Jerusalem is the inferior to Babylon, provide examples of suzerainty treaties. But perhaps the best known example of a suzerainty treaty is the Ten Commandments. Before we turn to the Big Ten, I need you to know that many suzerainty treaties existed in the ancient Near East. These treaties usually have the following elements. There's an introduction of the suzerain, history of the relationship between the two groups, with emphasis on the benevolent actions of the suzerain toward the vassal. There's usually a set of stipulations. These are the obligations imposed upon the vassal, generally detailing the requirements of loyalty to the suzerain, including prohibition of relationships with other powers, prohibition of attacks on another vassal or the suzerain, requirements to respond to a call to assistance from the suzerain, requirement to submit disputes with another vassal to the said suzerain, and payment of tribute. Provision for the deposit of copies of the treaty in the temples of the principal gods of the two parties, and often for its periodic public reading. Divine witness to the treaty. These would be lengthy lists of national deities of both parties who are summoned as witnesses to the treaty. Blessings for observance of the treaty and curses for violations of it, to be carried out by the gods who were its ultimate guarantors. Now, I encourage you to look at the Decalogue in your Bible. Turn to Exodus 20, beginning with verse 3. And as you work through the text, I would like you to place a solid line under the section that includes the identification of the suzerain. Place a double line under the section that rehearses the history of the relationship. Place a squiggly line under the stipulation that deals with the vassal's relationship with the suzerain. And place a double squiggly line under the stipulations that deal with relationships among the vassals. This exercise should take you about 10 minutes. Here are some questions for you to ponder. What were some of your observations about this exercise? Does this exercise prompt any new questions for you? How might this exercise inform your treatment of the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue in your faith tradition? Some scholars argue that on one level, the Ten Commandments can be interpreted as the text of the contract between Yahweh and Israel. Like treaties, the Decalogue begins with the identification of the suzerain. I am Yahweh, your God. and the brief history of what God has done for the Israelites, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The commandments that follow correspond to the stipulations of a treaty, with the first four concerning the relationship of Israel to Yahweh as vassal to suzerain. They demand absolute loyalty. You shall have no other gods apart from me, and specify the way Yahweh is to be worshipped. The remaining 6 commandments are comparable to the stipulations that concern relationships among vassals of the suzerain. Each individual Israelite is to respect his neighbor, that is, his fellow Israelites' life, person, marriage, legal reputation, and property, as well as to care for them when they are aged. In general, no witnesses or explicit blessing and curses are mentioned, but there may be echoes of these elements in the second commandment and in the motivation to honor father and mother. This chart maps the elements of a suzerainty treaty onto the Decalogue. Clearly, every element of the ancient suzerainty treaty cannot be mapped onto the Decalogue, but that so many in the same order can points to the close relationship between these ancient cultures. I hope you can see how the ancient Israelites, as those living among the larger ancient Near Eastern context, adopted and adapted this ancient Near Eastern format for their purposes. That is about all I wanted to add to your knowledge of covenants and treaties. With this information, we can dive deeper into Leviticus, the Holiness Code, and degrees of holiness. Thank you.